Welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Thank you for joining me here today on this special edition of the Cabral Concept, where we will be diving deep into the latest updates surrounding the virus and actually sharing with you specifically today who is most susceptible and what we can do about it. So the reason why this show came about specifically is because there are so many people out there worried, and rightly so, and fearful of this particular virus. Now, here's the issue. We've dealt with viruses before. We thought we knew what this virus was going to do specifically, and it took a different turn. So I want to share that with you today. I also want to give you specific stats and updates that are in addition to last week's show. Hopefully you did tune into episode 1630. All previous podcasts are available at stephencabral.com/podcasts. And today's show number is 1637. So you can head over to stephencabral.com/1637, and I will also embed last week's show. Last week's show was all the news, all of the updates, all of the real statistics. I say real statistics because there's no doubt about it, you are being lied to. And even when you're not being lied to, the story is being spun in order to keep you fearful, in order to keep you afraid and not wanting to even speak with your fellow human or neighbor or even family members. So here's what I want to do today. Again, tune into last week's show. That's the specific numbers. We talk about masks. Do the masks work? What type of masks work? When should you wear them? Does it even matter if you wear them? What do we need to do to move past this as fast as possible? So that was last week's show. Today, we're diving deep on who is most susceptible and the real truth behind the numbers. So what I want to share with you, and this is one way in which the media lies to you, one way that they keep you fearful. Now, people always ask, well, why would they do that? Well, here's the thing. Media is not a nonprofit. They are not there for the benevolence of society, right? They are there to be able to sell advertising and get a lot of views and then to sell more advertising and make a lot of money, right? So they're putting essentially profits before people. And that is why when you watch the news, you could just keep a little pad of paper in your lap and just write down on column A on the left, what stories have a negative undertone? Death, dying, violence, war, fires, etc., right? And then put a little check mark there with every story, right? Or you could even count up the time-wise, because the time-wise is going to be enormous. And then, meaning the coverage of that specific event. And then put a little tick on the right-hand column for anything positive, happy things that have happened, right? So I think that you'll find that it's most likely 90-10 or worse, at best 80-20. I think you're going to find more like 90-10. I stopped watching the news many, many years ago. But here's what I want to share with you is that when they know these studies have been done a long time ago, right? Because they would share positive news with you if it's sold. But the human mind has something called the limbic brain, the limbic system. And it's an older part of the brain, and it still serves us well to this day. Maybe not how we would like it to, because the limbic part of the brain essentially keeps us tuned into potential danger. And if there is danger, well, we stay high alert. And so we're going to tune in because the loop has been opened. I talked about that in my last Sunday email. So what does that mean when the loop's open? Well, the loop is open. It means there needs to be closure. You need to figure out how this story ends, right? It's a brilliant marketing, brilliant advertising-based scenario. But here's the thing. They never close the loop. They tell you, well, tune in next, right? That's how they get you through a commercial. Or here's what's going to be going on tomorrow. And also, when you have this, essentially, it used to be a mortality or death ticker on the side of the screen. One of the worst things I've ever seen. I mean, literally, just playing on the most fears and the worst of human nature, meaning like you're scaring people to keep tuning in to see how many people have died. Now they know that the death rate is going down, and we talked about that last week, and I'll give you more statistics this week as well. But what they're doing now instead, they've switched to case numbers, right? Since mortality is going down, well, they need to keep people tuned in. So now it's the rise of cases around the world, which is now about 15 million with a little over 600,000 deaths worldwide. Now, I'll tell you why those statistics aren't actually correct in just a moment. So here's what we know. We know that the media wants to keep you tuned in. We know that negativity opens the loop in the brain. It keeps us on alert, and we're most likely to tune in because there's a problem to solve, right? Well, with the media, they never solve that problem, right? It's always on to the next. If they solve one, well, here's the next problem that you need to stay tuned in for. The problem is, causes anxiety, causes fear, causes overwhelm, causes depression. And we're seeing this in children as well. There are some statistics out there that I can't actually qualify to make sure that those are actual real statistics, but we're looking at potentially a third of children, 40% of children potentially dealing with now anxiety-based disorders because they're around wearing masks. They're told they have to stay away from their grandparents. They're told they need to stay away from their neighbors. They need to do these social distancing play dates because they're worried that the kid next door could get them sick, even though we know the actual science says asymptomatic children are not going to be carriers of this particular virus. But never mind, the news won't tell you that, right? So now we continue to live in the fear. We live in the worst case scenario. And that's what I want to share with you today. Here's how the media lies to you specifically. And it's very, very interesting because when you look at the data, and I'm guaranteeing you that no one has shared this with you before, and it's because this is not common knowledge. We talk about it in epidemiology, but epidemiologists don't even share that with you because they're paid to go on the news and give you a specific agenda. I have no agenda at all. I really don't. What I want to do is keep this fair and really just give you the actual science and data. Well, here's the thing. A lot of times the media gives you what's called the case fatality rate. You can look this up. Actually, you know what? I'll provide all the links for you so you don't have to go digging if you don't want. You can go to stephencabral.com/1637, and I will link up all the links today. So the case fatality rate is you take the total number of cases and you divide that by the deaths. And so in the beginning, we had wild statistics about this virus. I mean, absolutely ludicrous and wild. So we had 20% death rate, right? 20% mortality rate. They call it a fatality rate, mortality rate, or death rate. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So it means that anybody who died from this particular virus, well, that was it. Well, when you go to a place like, let's say, Wuhan, where it most likely originated, they had 20% at one time. Well, what did that mean? Well, they were only testing the people, essentially, who entered the hospital, and 20% of those people were dying, right? So now all of a sudden, we have this case fatality rate of 20%. Well, what does the media tell you? Well, this virus now has a mortality rate of 20%. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means literally there's going to be something like 1.6 billion people killed from this particular virus. And that just starts to spread across the internet. It spreads across the media. And that's, people get really fearful. Of course. I mean, if 20% of people are dying from this particular virus, I mean, that is unbelievable. I mean, that is truly complete lockdown, stay inside. Somehow we'd have to have food delivery or whatever it might be. That would be unbelievable and unheard of, right? So, well, is that the case? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. But that is the case fatality rate. That's a real thing. That's a real statistic. You take the number of cases and you divide it by the number of deaths. Well, in the beginning, when you have no testing, but you have people dying, you don't even know, but you're attributing it to this particular virus. Well, what happens? You have a really high case fatality rate, right? And I'm not naming the particular virus, and most of you know why if you've been listening to the podcast. It's because I just continue to get banned from so many different social media channels, YouTube, Instagram, etc. But anyway, I just keep on pushing on, and the podcast continues every single day. So here's the next thing. Besides the case fatality rate, which we know is highly inaccurate and wildly overestimates, especially in the beginning, really until it's all over. And then when you get all the data in, you say, okay, these people actually, they didn't have the virus, they had the flu. And they still got pneumonia. And yes, one of the biggest complications of the flu is pneumonia, which is also a lung-based issue from inflammation in the lungs. And then what do we have? Well, now, and you can have fungal, you can have bacterial, and you can have viral-based. So, well, do they ever tell you that? No, there's no course correction, right? When we're going through this, they're not giving you the statistics right now on the flu when we know that potentially half of the people that we have right now with these particular virus-based deaths very well could be the flu. I mean, again, we don't know that specifically, but we do know that there's wild overestimation, at least in the United States. Potentially not anywhere else, but at least in the United States. So now the next statistic is called the crude mortality rate, often called the crude death rate. Now, crude meaning that They're basically, the number I just gave you, they're taking the amount of cases that they have. They're taking the case fatality rate, and then they're trying to figure out what is the potential mortality rate, right? That's what they're looking at. And so in the beginning, we've got about 8 billion people walking this earth, and they say 10% crude mortality rate. Well, they would say, okay, let's take the data now. We've got 8 billion people. We're going to take 10% of that or so, 800 million, if my math is correct, and 800 million. And that's where they got these statistics originally. I remember reading in the very beginning, and again, this is why I really have to call out any doctors, scientists, epidemiologists, and others to be careful what you say in public. Because these are very intelligent people, but the people who said these things, I will never trust them again. I just won't, because they automatically overreacted and they caused fear in the public. I mean, there are people at some of the top universities in the world telling us that probably somewhere in the range of 300 million people were going to die. That was basically the range, right? So, and where are they getting that number from? Well, the World Health Organization estimated about 3.4% crude mortality rate, and that would equal about 272 million people. So the estimates started coming out, okay, 4%, 300 million, 330 million or so, and that's where they started to get it. But you can't just repeat what the World Health Organization or other people say. You can't just blindly say that to people and say, about 300 million people are going to die from this. That's outrageous. And honestly, I mean, in my opinion, that's malpractice. Like, that is scaring people, sharing falsified information, because that hasn't been proven yet. I mean, this is in the early stages. We're talking about March and early April coming out with these wild numbers. And so it's wildly inaccurate. And so when we look at it, what we really need to do to find true statistics is go to the last measurement, and this is what we use. So we use something called the infection fatality rate. The infection fatality rate is the actual number of people with the disease. Okay, the actual number of people with the disease divided by the number of people that have died from the disease. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, it's difficult to figure out, because if you don't have enough testing, how do you know? And that's exactly the point. We don't know what the actual infection fatality rate is right now. We have no idea. But I was listening, and again, I do a lot of research on this, and I was listening to some brilliant doctors. One of them a Nobel Peace Prize winner. It was on a Tony Robbins interview. Dr. Levitt? Is it Dr. Levitt? Dr. Levine? Dr. Levitt? I can't remember at this point. Nobel Prize winner. Obviously, brilliant man, right? Brilliant man. I'm going to listen to him. I want to listen to his words. He's probably put in 40 years of work, 50 years of work. Brilliant man. And basically, he says, from the very beginning, this was mismanaged. From the very beginning. What we are looking at is not enough testing, and we are looking at most likely 2 to 3x maximum of the number of deaths from the flu. So we're looking at maybe double of what the flu would be. And it seems that he is correct. So on last week, I really went in depth on this. But the United States, and I'm recording this on July 21st, just to give you reference for when the date, because things obviously change every day. But the mortality rate, the number of deaths from this particular virus has gone down every single week, okay, for the past about 6 weeks or so. And that was predicted. I've been talking about this and doing weekly, bi-weekly updates since March. And in the beginning, we were all worried. I was worried as well. I mean, I have 2 young girls, my wife, I've got parents in their 60s. My parents are in the 60s. So, of course, we're all worried, because why wouldn't we be? We want to keep all our loved ones safe. But now the United States has tested 50 million people. So we see this massive spike in what? The number of cases. Well, of course we see a massive spike in the number of cases. Why? You will always see a spike in the number of cases when there are 7 to 10x the amount of tests. But what happens is, and I have a beautiful graph, I didn't create it. This is, again, all independent research. I'll post it today on the podcast page. And it shows the cases going basically hockey sticking, right? Because we've got testing for about the last 6 to 8 weeks. Now you see the cases go way up, but you see the actual mortality stay the same. So the mortality, the number of deaths is actually going down or staying the same when the cases are going way, way, way up. Well, how can that be? Isn't the crude mortality rate right on? Isn't the case fatality rate on? No, it's not. And the reason is that 70% or more of the people are asymptomatic. They get the virus, they feel nothing, or they feel minor symptoms, right? So it's what you're being told to is categorically false. This does not mean that the virus is not something to worry about, right? It is. Something to live in fear? No. Something to take precautions about? Yes. And that's what we're going to get into now, okay? Most likely, again, I can't give you this specifically, but most likely what we're going to find out when all of this is said and done, that it's somewhere around the rate of the flu, which is around 0.1%, to potentially 0.2% of a mortality rate. And some good statistics based on a very large sample size, being New York City, that got hit the hardest in the United States, had a 0.28. All right. So if we're looking at a 0.28, based on that, that seems about right. We also saw, and there was a very good case study from the very beginning, which is why I was not fearful after I heard this. When an entire cruise ship, basically, this particular virus ran through the cruise ship was quarantined, nobody was allowed off, we got to actually see a sample size of all different ages of people on that cruise ship, and many of them older. And it was less than a 1% mortality rate. So when I saw that, I said, that's real data. Those are real people. That's a big sample size. 1,000 or so people on the cruise ship. I actually think it was like in the high 600s. And we got to see that it wasn't too far off probably from this 0.28. Okay, so does that mean that we should not worry at all? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. That's why we're going to go into who's most susceptible. And let's talk about that right now. So when we look at the real statistics, we're looking at those people under 65 years old have a 0.09 crude death or crude mortality rate. That's obviously nowhere even close to the numbers of the flu. Just want to mention that, right? Because the flu actually affects younger people. This particular virus does not. We're talking small, rare percentages. 0.09 under 65. That still includes people in their 50s, right? Now, when you get to children, we're looking at 0%. We're looking at essentially 0%. And the other issue then is that when we look at people over the age of 80 years old, we are looking at somewhere around 14.3%. And of course, I'll link these charts up for you. So that's where it tips, right? But I shared with you last week as well. Let me go through the numbers just a bit more, okay? So 0 to 17 years old, the mortality rate 0.02, okay? Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about children. We're talking about teenagers, many of which pre-existing conditions, okay? But still 0.02. 18 to 44 years old, 0.8. Okay, so now we're big range again. We're going over 25 years, 25-year range, 18 years old all the way up to 44 years old, 0.8%. Now, 45 years to 64 years, 3.7%, okay? And then 65 years old to 74, you've got a 6.5%. Again, these are not based on all the new people testing, right? Because these numbers are going to go down and down and down, okay? But I'm just sharing with you. You can start to see how it happens by age. 75 plus, 14.3%. Do you see why this is a virus that unfortunately, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunately, but it is what it is. It is most detrimental to those people over the age of 65. That's the truth. And for men, it's about 2x the mortality rate to women. So men, almost 2%, almost 2x higher. Right? When we look at the actual percentages. The percentages, as this is about 4 weeks of information data, a little bit more than that, 61.8% men got this particular virus, 38.2%. And that's just, again, those are from the people that we know. Many more women could easily have it, but just be asymptomatic. We need more testing. That's the only way that we know. So I just want to share with you another statistic. 89% of the patients entered in the hospital that died from this particular virus had an underlying health-based condition. That's really important to note. And when you look at the other statistics, there's only 0.9% of the population that we believe didn't, that we just don't know. 0.9%. So there's another about 10% of unknown. So 89% definitely had an underlying health condition. We'll talk about heart in a second. 10% we don't know, and 0.9% we believe they did not. Okay, so just again, I want to give you the real statistics. And the days from first symptom to death were approximately 14 days, with those 70 years and older being around 11.5. So this is important as well because we are looking at people that are most vulnerable with the immune system in general. So if you have a strong, healthy immune system, is this something that you should be extremely fearful of? My opinion is no. And let me give you a little bit more data to back that up. Pre-existing conditions that were most vulnerable to this particular virus, you're most susceptible, cardiovascular disease. Think of it as high cholesterol, clogged arteries, inflammation, etc. Inflammation particularly around the arteries. I'm not going to go too deep into that. Anything with cardiovascular-based disease, 13.2% of that, with a 10.5 mortality. Diabetes. Diabetes is an important one. I'm going to circle back to that at the end. 9.2%. Chronic respiratory disease, meaning already having lung-based issues, 8%. Hypertension, high blood pressure, 8.4%. And cancer, 7.6%. And that's why you do hear about people dying in their 40s and et cetera. And unfortunately, many of them had complications as well from cancer. Now, I will let you know, a lot of the people in that 10% where maybe they didn't have an underlying health condition, many of them were overweight. And that's important to look at it because, and this is why I always talk about it on my Wednesday shows, losing weight is not about vanity. It doesn't matter to me whether you want to look this way or the other way. That doesn't matter to me at all. But I can tell you this. The more weight your body carries, more likely the higher the inflammation, the higher the endogenous production of estrogen. And it's just, in general, it's harder on the body. And it's also harder on the lungs. It is harder to breathe. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, very well-known pulmonologist, he tells me, shares me the stories. No one individually, obviously it's kept confidential, but the amount of pressure on the human chest cavity when just lying down when overweight, it's crushing the internal organs, the lungs. So a lot of people, when overweight, are actually sleeping up, more upright. What I want to share with you is this is another predisposition to this particular virus. So we've got cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, hypertension, cancer, and then potentially being overweight as well. So when we look at all of these particular statistics, if we're using science and if we're using the actual stats, I can share with you, children, it's almost 0%. And I love hearing that, and that's because I have two young girls. They're both under 10 years old, and I want to make sure they're safe. But also those decisions, again, have to be taken into account when we say, should schools open up or not? And I can't make that decision. That's out of my hands. It's really my opinion. It doesn't necessarily matter in that particular realm. I think I'm one opinion of many. We should all come together. We should listen to both sides, and we should put our fears on the table. And we should also then say, well, does that check out with this particular science? And it's kind of like, well, what do we do? And again, I don't have all the answers when it comes to that. I want to share with you valid information, scientific information, unbiased information, and then let you make the best decision for you and your family and your community. Because again, I shouldn't make that decision for you. It's your decision. It's up to you. It's your family. It's your kids or it's your grandparents, whatever it might be. So I just want to make sure that you're informed though. But the nice thing is that if you're under 65 years old, and you don't have any pre-existing conditions, the likelihood that you die from this particular virus, very small, very, very small. And when I say that, then I say this. Well, if you're 65 years old or older, or you have a pre-existing condition, ask for help. Ask someone you know, a neighbor, a child, a friend, a coworker, to be able to go out to busier places like a Home Depot or a Costco or a Walmart. You don't need to do that. Ask someone else to go and pick things up. I'm always asking my neighbors. I've got some elderly neighbors around me up here in Maine, and I'm saying, what do you need me to pick up? Is there anything I can grab for you? And a lot of them are independent. They want to go out. They still want to do these particular things, and they wear a mask. They do what they can, and you can check out, again, which masks work and which ones actually don't on last week's previous podcast. So I see it this way. I mean, we have a duty as anybody who's fortunate enough to be healthy right now, who's, taking care of themselves, they're under 65. Let's urge the people most at risk to stay safe. And it's not that we shouldn't be safe, but if you go back to last week's podcast, we have to build herd immunity. And again, I know people don't want to hear that, but because it goes right back to fear. But you have to understand, you have to look at the statistics, you have to see where we're at, and we can boost our immune system. We really can. There's so much we can do. I've talked about that on previous podcasts. I write about it in the Rain Barrel Effect. And what I want people to do is understand that you really can take control of your body. Not everything is given. Not everything is a guarantee, but you can do everything that you can within your power. And it doesn't take a lot, but it takes a little bit of following the nutrition, the exercise, the stress reduction, the toxin removal, the sleep, the emotional balance, the scientifically based supplements, and a good success mindset. That's what I call the de-stress protocol. Again, I write about that in my book. And what I want people to do is just get back into healthier living. Use this as a time to kind of reassess where you're at in life. Lose the weight if it's not serving you. Get back into a healthier eating regime, start moving the body, even if it's just with walking. All of these things do add up. So, of course, if there's anything I can do, always feel free to reach out. My team and I, you can join our free Facebook group, which is cabralsupportgroup.com. You can email us at support@equilibriumnutrition.com. We do free lab assessment or selection calls. So whatever we can do, again, just let us know. We're here to help. Thank you so much. And of course, if this podcast was helpful, please do feel free to share it with anyone you believe it could serve. Before you go, I wanted to share a personal story with you. The real reason I began to get well finally is because I figured out what was wrong with me. And that might seem pretty obvious, but I went from doctor to doctor for over 2 years before discovering at-home functional medicine lab testing. These are the labs that enabled me to finally figure out what was wrong with my hormones, blood sugar, electrolytes, and gut health. And once I knew what was wrong, I could then follow a proven plan in order to rebalance my body from the inside out. This is why I believe so strongly in functional medicine lab testing and why I've made it my mission to share these labs with the world. Now at equa.life, you can order an at-home lab test or a lab bundle for you and your family and be able to complete it within the week. Plus, the EquaLife difference is that you're not left to try to read and figure out these labs on your own. We explain what your lab numbers mean, what they mean in the much bigger picture, and then how to go about rebalancing your body in order to heal. To see our full selection of lab tests, or to set up a free lab selection call to find out what labs may be best for you, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. And do remember, we ship these all over the world. To find out more and to set up your free lab selection call, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. That's EQUI.LIFE/labs.